Hi, my name is Kireet Khurana and I'm a filmmaker, and I just finished a film on the homeless in India. And it was really an eye-opening experience for me. It was a soul cleansing. It really shook my conscience, whatever I saw. Do you know that the homeless in India are very, very different from the homeless in the rest of the world? No, they are not the same. In India, the homeless are actually incarcerated. They are punished under law for their poverty, for their misery, for being on the streets. There is a law that actually subjugates them, incarcerates them, and puts them in jail. And that is ironical, isn't it? They're already suffering, and then we are inflicting even more suffering and misery on them. And I wanted to understand where this law is coming from and why is it so that we cannot get rid of this law, and why was it framed in the first place? And I tried to look for answers and I couldn't find a better person to speak to than Usha Ramanathan. And she's so articulate and she's so fabulous. And Usha is one of the most prominent figures working on law, poverty, and rights. She researches, she writes, and she speaks on issues that include laws of nature, mass displacement, manual scavenging, beggary, criminal law, custodial institutions, and the works, everything pretty much under the sun. And she is really deep into the law side of it, and her work draws heavily upon non-governmental experience and engagement with the state on the matters of public policy. So she's got a huge variety of experience, and of course she's also been awarded the Access Now's Human Rights Heroes Award in 2019. And I'm so happy to have Usha here with us today to talk about the law and to talk about the homelessness and the Beggary Act of 1959. So Usha, I would like to understand on this World Homeless Day that the people who are homeless, who are into the act of beggary, they are very different from the rest of the world in terms of the fact that they have been persecuted and they have been ostracized and they have been incarcerated under a very draconian law, the 1959 Bombay Beggary Act. I want to understand what the provisions of the law are and what does it actually mean? What does the law actually mean?
See, the Anti-Beggary Law in 1959 came in at a time when the state, it was a new state. India had recently become independent. It was a new state, and the state was trying to figure out how to deal with the various elements of our population. So there is, for instance, they dealt with slums in a certain kind of way. Then they didn't really think of it as homelessness as much as at that stage, as they noticed the phenomenon of begging. And they felt the need to deal with this phenomenon of begging because it's like it has two different branches. One side of it, they were saying that, all these people who are begging, we need to bring them in, train them, give them, rehabilitate them. So train them and send them back out so that they can then sustain themselves on the work that they will be able to do. The other aspect of it was where they saw them as a nuisance, that we don't want to see this kind of visible poverty, and people shouldn't be coming out and asking you for things. So this confusion in the mind of the lawmaker at that time is visible even within the law. But soon after the law was made, the idea of rehabilitation just became custody. You could arrest a person who was ostensibly poor, who did not have a visible means of subsistence. That's the phrase. That if you looked at them, you didn't know that they had a job. So if, for instance, you work in a garage and you're a garage mechanic and you're scruffy and you go back and you sleep on the street, you're actually an employed person. You're working for your livelihood, but you're seen as ostensibly poor and potentially a person in beggary. And so they would pick them up and arrest them and send them into a custodial institution. Now, the original idea of the custodial institution was that we bring you into this, it's a home, and you come here and we impart skills to you so that you can go back and you can go out to work and sustain this. But that got dropped very early. The state really hasn't put in any kind of effort into this. And what has happened is just treat persons who are on the street, visibly poor, poor state, you look at them and you think that they are not, that they won't have a means of subsistence, treat them as persons in beggary and pick them up and put them into custodial institutions, which completely changes the idea of poverty into criminality. Because they are then, the liberty is taken away and they are put into an institution, they can't get out till the court orders. The second thing is, because you had a law, their first encounter with the state would be with the police. And the police is a law and order force. They are not a social justice and empowerment force, right? So if you're going to have the police pick them up, obviously they round them up and they take them away to a magistrate who is told that these are all people we found begging on the street, whether they were actually begging or not. And then the magistrate, sends them off to a hospital where they have to be checked to make sure they don't have tuberculosis or any skin disease. They're sent off to the institution. So with this, a law that was supposed to help persons in destitution to be able to rise up above destitution became a law that was used to suppress persons in various conditions of poverty and economic. Many of them are not even in economic distress. So you find that they are then segregated from the rest of the world. Now, in other countries meaning some of the places where we've studied this, you find that aggressive panhandling is considered an offense, which means that you can ask, but you can't threaten people, saying that if you don't give, I'm going to cause you some harm. That they say don't do. But if you're in need, you can put your hand up and ask. You can speak to a person and ask. You see so often that homeless people on the street don't find work. See, many homeless people also work. We must remember that. But people who are unable to work put a little banner before them saying, I am homeless, drop a few pence. It's a sight that we do see even in developed countries. That's not considered an offense. In India, we had a judgment in 2007, which for the first time, in the Delhi High Court, which for the first time acknowledged that, it's a strange situation where we say, if I want to work for the poor, I can get a license to collect money. I can stand at the street corner with a chanda dabba, it's not a problem. But if I am hungry, I can't go to someone and say, I am hungry, can you give me a little something? So the High Court acknowledged that, this treatment of people is an unconstitutional, they didn't use the word unconstitutional because it wasn't challenged as unconstitutional then. But later, in recent times, 2 High Courts have said that this kind of law cannot survive the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. I remember this wonderful incident of this person who was probably a homeless or a beggar, and he was very hungry and he wanted to go, he kind of stole a few pieces of loaves of bread, and obviously he was arrested and taken to the court, and the court did kind of put a fine on him. But the judge also said that, it's the society which is responsible for it. And so the judge paid the fine, even though he fined the poor person and let him go. He said, like, a society that cannot even provide basic necessity and basic food and basic amenities to all its citizens, it's really pathetic. And so it was a very telling incident. Sorry?
Which country was this?
This was in New York. So, this was very kind of sordid tale there, and it was something that sort of really stayed with me, that, we are treating a poor like, really, we have anti-poor laws, and we are really extremely high-handedness in terms of the thing, and there is a great deal of insensitivity, and, I think even the lawmakers understand that this law probably needs to go, right? And what is being done about that? I mean, you've been part of some committees as well to try to repeal this act, and you work with a lot of people in this domain to kind of being a law researcher. You have worked to kind of frame laws to try to repeal this draconian law of Bombay Beggary Act, which is still in 20 states, which is still being implemented, and people are still being put in beggars' homes, and it's very, very sad. So what's being done to repeal the law?
See, the first thing, of course, is to recognize that they are citizens. They are not just persons in poverty. They are citizens. And if they are citizens, they are entitled to all the rights that you and I are entitled to, and more. Because, in fact, fundamental rights and human rights jurisprudence is basically meant for people who have less, so that they can, help themselves and be helped in raising them from wherever they are. Because you can't say that this is a static condition of poverty. So one of the early interventions that had to be made was to tell the state that the state needed to legislatively prioritize the repeal of a law of this kind. And to explain that, we found that there were different ways of explaining this. One of the ways that we found was to say, what is it that this law does which it should not be doing anymore? And the first thing in that is that what does an anti-beggary law do? It picks up a person who they think is sin beggary and puts them into institutions. So the first thing that it does is to deprive them of liberty, put them through a judicial process over which they have no control, and allows a discharge from that institution to happen only when the judiciary is later, presented the case and if they are convinced. So the first thing that we found was that this whole process and the process that the police has on the ground of raids and rounding up of people who they think are in beggary, that has to stop. So the first element was, don't criminalize poverty. The second element was to say that, okay, what do you do with them when you pick them up? You take them into custody and put them into an institution and build high walls around that institution. Then we don't see what is happening behind that and we don't care about them. This is a process that we call invisibilizing. There are various ways in which we invisibilize. One of those is by putting these, putting people who get picked up behind walls, which we cannot see through. And what it also does is, see, like I was saying, not all people who are found on the streets are people who are in beggary. It's a very small percentage who are forced to beg. Everybody makes an effort to find a job, and when they find it, they want to sustain themselves. So you find that when they get picked up and put away, people who had jobs, who were maybe part of a cluster of contract employees, part of somebody who was a daily wager who would go with others to find work. Now they can't go back to the place that they came from. The first thing that custody does is to cut you off. So you may be unavailable for 4 days, 14 days, 1 month, 1 year, and then you go back, whatever little work you had has gone. The second thing that it does is it stigmatizes. You tell me if somebody came from a beggar's home and they told you that for 6 months they had been kept in a beggar's home, or even for 1 day, would you take them into your employ without wondering whether you were doing the right thing? Custodial institutions stigmatize. So we add to the burden of poverty with this stigma. So the second rule that we made for ourselves in thinking about this was no custody. The third rule that we've been working with is to say, don't bring the police into this. Poverty is not a crime. Police are used to dealing with law and order issues. Poverty becomes a law and order issue when you make it the job of the police to deal with it.
So one of the counter arguments that you hear about this is the fact that I've heard a lot of people who are not concerned with the law and not concerned with this strata of society. They clearly say, these people are into drugs. They are malaise to the society, and they have gangs, and they are into criminal activities. They do a lot of others. They are thieves. They steal a lot of things. They basically, like you said, the nuisance aspect of it is there, pretty much there. Now, if this law goes away, how do you actually control these people? And these people are not us. There is a separation. They are them, and we are us. We're different. And of course, a lot of them are malingerers, because you offer them jobs, and they don't take jobs, and they don't want to work. So even if I'm offering a job to a person who's begging on the streets or selling me some goods, and I say, listen, why don't you work in my house? They say, no, we don't want to work. So what is your argument for it? Because I think the general perception is that these people, they don't really want to help themselves. This is the general perception. So how do you control that criminality aspect that they are into drugs and they have gangs and they have a whole lot of other issues related to them.
So you put up about 20 questions together in one question. So as I disaggregate it, let me see how much of it I'm able to recall as I go along. So I'll start with your very interesting use of a word. How do we control these people? See, the tragedy of the Indian legal system and the way in which it is, it is enforced, is that a large part of it you'll find is used especially in relation to persons in various conditions of poverty. It is used to control the poor. It is not used to help them get out of it. It is used to control them. Criminal law was not meant to be used in a way for controlling a people. People have freedom. People have liberty. When they do wrong, criminal law will step in. The law defines what is the wrong. In the anti-beggary law, asking, first of all, being to look poor and to look without visible means of subsistence has become a crime in the anti-beggary law. The second thing is being hungry and asking somebody for some kind of succor is also treated as a crime. These are all legal definitions. All these other things that you were saying, if somebody is a pickpocket, if somebody is, drugs, of course, we have a whole different regime on drugs, and I'll just come to that in a minute. But if there are people committing crime, we don't have a criminal justice system which says that you can just pick people up because they are potential criminals. We had this law that the British brought in called the Criminal Tribes Act, where people who belong to a certain tribe were presumed to be criminals. So no individual in that could, could venture out of it. And the persons who were in that category had to fight a battle to be able to get out of it and to say that, all right, we will decriminalize it. And then later, what are they called? They're called de-notified tribes. So you again refer back to the idea of criminality that was attributed to them. We are treating the various kinds of people in poverty in this country in a similar kind of way. We are saying this class of people commit crime. This class of people get into drugs. This class of people are nuisances to us. So the class has to be dealt with as a class. But when I do a wrong, say for instance corporates, there have been a lot of corporate criminality in our setup. We don't say that class of people are committing crime, pick them all up and deal with them. You say deal with them as an individual. Deal with them as each company. In criminal law, if you find a person committing a crime, you can deal with them. You can't say that these people are a class who have the potential to commit crime, and how else will they be surviving other than by committing crime? This comes from a deep ignorance. In fact, my experience with the law, with the relationship between law and persons in poverty tells me that it is the poor who can least afford to commit crime. They avoid committing offenses as much as they can because they know if they get into that net, it's very difficult to get out of it. So I've actually found that, and there are many stories I can tell you about how people have walked with this prejudice and then have to change this prejudice because people work. Shankarji in MKSS used to say that they are so many people feel that all these poor people should not be given social security pension when they turn 60. All of us worked and we are getting our pension. Why should they be given pension? And he says, do you know when you're in poverty, how much work you have to do just to stay alive? And if you've reached 60, what does that mean about the amount of work you've put in? So I think, this comes from a complete misunderstanding of what persons in poverty do for themselves and for their lives and for their families. It's a complete misconception, and I understand the ignorance. But I don't think we should allow that ignorance to become the law and to become public policy.
So I believe there were some efforts that were taken to kind of repeal the law as well, and I think you were also involved with the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment to actually work towards repealing this law. We'd like to understand where is it specifically right now, and where is it stuck, and why is it not being taken to a logical conclusion. After all, it seems like it's a logical thing to just kind of repeal something that is so archaic and so inhuman in that sense, because it's making the poor even more poorer in that sense, not giving them a chance at all. So where do you think that law is?
It's interesting you asked this because after a lot of this conversation happening in different places, of writing, of negotiating to understand what the law is, we find that in two high courts they have actually struck down this law, and in the Delhi High Court they struck down certain provisions of the law, and in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court virtually almost all parts of the law were struck down as being unconstitutional. Now, if this and it's the same law, you've seen those legislations. The same, it's a kind of imitative process of lawmaking that's happened in this. In fact, Delhi didn't even bother to imitate. They just said whatever the law is in Bombay, we are just taking it and adopting it for our not even adapting. So you find that if two courts have found that this is unconstitutional, and they say it is against Article 14, Article 19, Article 21, it's against the whole basic structure of our constitution, then obviously this law cannot survive. I mean, it makes no sense to think that it can survive in other jurisdictions, but it's unconstitutional only in 2 states. So till these judgments came in a couple of years ago, we had to struggle a lot to explain that why it is unconstitutional. Now I think we've crossed that stage. Some states have said that let's not be without any law at all, because legislators may not fully understand what the implication of no law situation is in the context of persons in beggary. Now we find that there is no such thing as a person in beggary. There are persons who may beg. If we forget the person, then all we'll see is begging. There are no beggars. For instance, there are no criminals. There are people who commit crimes. There are no lepers. There are persons who have leprosy. So if we forget the person, we get inhuman. So we need to reintroduce the person into this conversation. The second thing is that it is about destitution. What we need to treat is the problem of destitution, not about people who are in destitution having to go and ask people for various kinds of things. So we've been pushing for this, saying that if there is to be a law which is concerned with persons in various conditions of destitution or poverty, then it can only be to empower some departments of the state to reach out and offer services to people who are in these various conditions. There is one request I have for all of us. It is that, when people grow up, everybody grows up into adulthood. In fact, many of us, because we are so protected, grow up naive and not really knowing the world. These are people who know the world. They've had to deal with the world every day of their lives. And still we don't treat them like grown-up adults. When we turn 18, we say, treat me like an adult. But when a poor person turns 18, we want to keep them at best in a paternalistic kind of format, where we will tell them what to do, we'll tell them where to go, we'll pick them up and put them in institutions. This relationship between a person who wants to help and the person who they are trying to help, you have to establish these relationships of trust. Then it's possible that a person in poverty may say, okay, I want to come and get trained, help me get trained, and I want to go out and work, I trust you. If you take away custody and you introduce the idea of destitution for whom the state takes responsibility, you'll come up with a very different answer. You won't come up with an answer which is as inhumane as the law makes all of us today.
Usha, actually, one of the major concerns is the fact that these gangs are, out on the loose, and they create a lot of ruckus, and they have a lot of, even these so-called beggars on the road, they are being controlled by the gangs, and basically it's a syndicate or a mafia of sorts that obviously they are running. And it's pretty prevalent. Everybody knows about it. What are your thoughts on that? If the law goes away, what's going to happen?
Two things. One is that you say everybody knows about it. And I wonder what they really know. Because all of these are stories that you hear, but I can't recall a single case where a gang has been caught and the gang leader has been tried and has been put, and the law has been used against a gang leader. We hear, for instance, I remember when in 2007-8, when I was, writing the first piece that I did, I found that there was this two doctors who had been found, amputating the legs of people, and this was the charge laid against them. And then you didn't hear about it at all. So, see, to deal with this, we already have the Indian Penal Code. The Indian Penal Code deals with this as an offense. If you're going to kidnap people, if you're going to force people into beggary, if you're going to make money off this kind of, of work that you're putting people to, then you ought to be punished. And the law should be taking action against them. That is not what the beggary law is about. There's just a small provision there which is much better explained in the Indian Penal Code. So that law that has hardly been operationalized.
So I would like to again play the devil's advocate here, and I would like to say that one of the things that has been firmly established, I believe, is the fact that women on the streets are abused. They are abused and they are sexually abused, and there are a lot of rapes happening in the rapes happening within on the streets itself, and that is something that we hear about a lot. What do you say about that? I mean, there is some criminality that is happening on the streets, right?
Yeah, of course. There's criminality being practiced on the poor.
Yeah.
See, when people are homeless and they're out on the street, they are being subjected to various kinds of abuse, including sexual abuse. Why would you criminalize them? Aren't they the ones who need protection? And how often do you hear? I mean, there was the case that came from Patna, which I think you know about too, where this woman was found on the street pregnant. She had been raped multiple times. She had lost a bit of her mind, in the sense like there was a certain dislocation in her mind for a while. A non-governmental organization picked her up, and then she wanted. The idea was to get an abortion done so that she doesn't have to go through with all of this. But then the non-governmental organization didn't act in time. Another one moved in. Through that whole process, finally the child was born, and the woman died a month after the child was born. Now the point is that the experience of that woman living 12 years on the street was a horrendous experience. What have we learned from it? That we know that now there's no doubting that people on the street get exploited sexually, and otherwise they get exploited all the time. So who are you punishing for this? How can you punish the woman on the street? How can you punish the homeless? How can you punish the destitute?
If I were to ask you, my last question is, if I were to ask you on this homeless day, what advice would you give to people who are not aware of the issues of the homeless, issues of the destitute, issues of people who are who are into beggary? What advice would you give, and how do you think we can all visibilize these invisibles and how we can help them? What would your advice, what your simple advice would be that is completely doable?
Yeah, I usually have for people who don't have either the time or the inclination to really set out and do something about this, I say that's okay. Everybody is entitled to lead their own lives. But if you can't do good, do no harm. It's a simple prescription. And, if you can't help somebody, at least don't harm them by going and having, setting the law on them, setting the police on them, complaining about them. Work with them if you can. But if you don't have, that's okay. Everybody can't be doing everything. But if we lose that one element of compassion where we are not able to do very much about it, but we can harm and we harm people, we must remember that poverty is a very difficult condition to live in. And poverty is also a very difficult condition to get out of without honest help and effort. If the poor were really making no effort at all, they wouldn't even be alive. Because it's so, like I was saying, everything has to be bought. And legality has to be bought. So every day of their lives, they are working to keep themselves and their families alive. The little that we can do to help, if we can't help, let us not harm.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful statement. If you can't do good, don't do any harm, because I think all of us need to understand and recognize the privileges on this World Homeless Day. I think it's a very, very powerful statement. So Usha, much thanks for your insight. I think you're easily one of the best and most educated individuals I have met, with the heart in the right place in terms of the empathy that you have for the disenfranchised, the marginalized, homeless people. And we really hope that you are successful in repealing the law and getting a new law in place along with your stakeholders. And we really hope there is a new beginning for the 70 million homeless people that there are in India, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.